Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in today with us, whether you are joining us live or watching the replay of this last Insight series of the year, and what a year it has been. For those of you who don't know me, I am Pauline Vicard, the co-founder and executive director of ARENI Global, a research and action institute dedicated to the future of fine wine, and it's my huge pleasure to be your host and guide this discussion today. Insight series, they're part of our annual research and action program, and they aim to provide a platform for international thought leaders to share ideas and address global issues collectively. I am thrilled to host so many of you today. We were at maximum capacity for this event, so thank you very much for your interest. It is a pleasure to welcome some of our core members in the audience, and so many new names. I can only wish that they were matched with a face. If you want to tell us in the chat who you are and where you come from, it's always so nice to hear and to learn from you. As for us, ARENI is a non-for-profit organization, and there are several ways that you can help us should you find this conversation and our research relevant. If you're in a position to do so, please consider becoming a member, either as an individual or a business. I'll post some links later in the chat because I can't do two things at the same time. And of course, if you are not following us already, please follow us on social media and subscribe to our newsletter so that you can stay in touch with our research and publication. Again, I'll put all the link in the chat after that. Some rules of conversation. Again, there should be quite a lot of us today, and we want this session to be yours as much as possible. Prepared some questions, of course, but what we want is integrate your questions and your interest as much as possible. Please use the chat to comment and add your thoughts to the mix. I might not be able to react to it and to react to everything live, but I always read the content of the chat afterwards, so you can drop me some jokes as well if you want. It helps a lot for our post-discussion analysis. So please do share your stories, your insights, your comments, and I might reach out to some of you afterwards to include that to our analysis afterwards. And please clearly flag all your questions for the panel in the Q&A box, otherwise I might not see them, and I apologize for that. And now, some context about our theme today. For our last Insight series of the year, we wanted to address a topic that is very close to our hearts and maybe reflect on a sentence that could be the sentence of 2020. I'm sure you've all heard it 1,000 times, but this year we've heard more than ever that we are in this together. But again, what does it mean for fine wine? What does being together mean, and what's at stake when we're talking about collective systems? This is a complex topic, so bear with me. I'd like to give you some context here, so you're sure that you are in the right conversation and we manage your expectation. This is not the first discussion that we've got on the topic, and this is not the beginning of research for us. There's a lot of things already at your disposal for free in our website. I spent part of my November talking to neuroscientists and sociologists, wondering why individuals come together at all. And actually the answer is very simple. We wouldn't have survived otherwise. We get together because we need to. And there's a particular quote that I like from one of our latest podcasts is, we think of history as being made by genius adventurers, individual men and women, but in fact, it's done by everybody together. Wine Collective and organization have followed the same models. And to prepare this conversation, I came to the conclusion that historically, wine people, winemakers, the wine ecosystem came together through three different models. The first one was the appellation or the regional system. Like, we get together and we promote our wine together because we are from the same locality. Then we've seen the classification system emerge. We get together and we promote our wines together because we produce wines of the same level of perceived quality. So that's the Grand Cru Classé de Bordeaux, the 100 Parker Points wine, all of that could enter that category. And then more recently, what we are seeing developing is what I call the community system. So we get together and we promote our wine together because we think the same way, regardless of where we come from, and we share a common ethos and values. So that could be, Premium Family Vini, the International Wineries for Climate Action, or all of those systems. Now that we are indeed facing a new crisis, one that has accelerated change and overturned many of the assumptions, can those established systems still, cater to our ecosystem, short and long-term needs? Are they still relevant? To what format, to what extent? And can we think of other ways of getting together in order to address this new normal? So we will have the pleasure to investigate this with our panelists today. Thank you very much for being with us. I am thrilled to welcome 5 amazing personalities coming to us from diverse backgrounds, history and vision. This will only be a short, snapshot of their bios. There's more detail about each of them on our website. Marc Almer is chef sommelier at Borolac. He's tuning in from Switzerland and is also the current best sommelier of the world. Well, he's talented, humble, passionate, extremely clever. And I, for one, can't wait to see the big and bright impact he will continue to have on the future of our ecosystem. No pressure at all, Marc, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Pauline.
Then we've got Michael Baum, depending on where you're tuning from, and is tuning actually from my home country in Burgundy. His first career was in tech, and he's now an adopted joyeux enfant de la Bourgogne, having purchased the Château de Pommard in 2014, transforming both viticulture, now all in biodynamics, and the distribution model. At the end of 2020, actually in a couple of days, a couple of weeks, Michael will launch Vivant, his latest project gathering like-minded producers from all around the world. Thank you very much, Michael, for being with us today and treating us with some en primeur news. I can't wait to hear more. Master of Wine Vanessa Cronlin is head of Wine for Wine Access, a national direct-to-consumer e-commerce wine retailer, where she oversees all wine curation and wine content. In 2020, this year, her company made its way into the Wine Enthusiast top 5 US wine retailer of the year. And thanks notably to Vanessa's work and talent. So congratulations, Vanessa, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Another Michael Munksburger, is here with us today wearing 2 hats. So he is the award-winning winemaker for Schloss Gobelsberg, one of the oldest and most acclaimed wineries in Austria. He's a fervent advocate for uncompromised quality, and he is also the president of, bear with me, Österreich Tradition Weingüter. Please do share my apologies for my terrible pronunciation with all the members of the Austrian Association of Traditional Wineries. Sorry for that. And last but certainly not least, Raquel Sibra is an executive board member for Sograp, Portugal's number one wine company. She brings us brands such as Mateus Rosé, along with legacy wines amongst the finest bottles that Portugal has to offer. She heads sustainability, public relations, and international distribution. And Raquel is also in charge of the relationship with Brussels, another aspect of working together that I am really looking forward to investigate. So here we are, and I thought that we have the chance today to have 2 of our panelists that originally do not come from the wine world and have a glorious past in the tech world. And so I thought we could start by taking a step back, and Raquel and Michael, you are both coming from outside the fine wine world with, as I mentioned, previous careers in startups and tech. How does the collective notion work in tech? It seems to me that they work really better, like they're really better at working together than we could be in the wine world. Raquel, have you seen any differences in how the tech world works together, and why do you think there's so many differences in how the wine world works?
Thank you, Pauline.
If you don't mind starting, over to you.
I think there's something about wine that makes it fascinating, but also at the same time makes it harder for people to join forces. And I think that has to do with, time and the relationship that people have with time. We work on yearly cycles, and there's nothing we can do because that's what, how nature is. We tend to think long term. We tend to be in this industry, I think, for a longer term than in other activities, and therefore, when you think of joining forces, you need personal trust. You need, the relationships. I think, when I think of it, it's almost like you're choosing a spouse. There's a lot of weight into that decision. What I see, in startups or in other industries that I've worked with throughout the years, it's more transactional. People come together. It's a shorter term. It's lighter. It's less personal. There are less strings. So I think that's why it's easier for them to join forces than it is in the wine business. When I say it's harder, it happens. I think it usually takes more time, to happen.
And Michael, you come from one of the maybe most open-minded places in the world, the Silicon Valley in California, and you enter Burgundy, which is traditionally not seen as being that open. What were the main obstacles and fears that coming into the wine world you've identified as being in the way of effective collaboration?
Well, maybe before I answer that, I just wanted to go back to what Raquel was saying about the tech world and the wine world collaborating. I wouldn't say that the tech world is less personal. I think you could talk to anybody who works 10 years on a startup company. It's very personal. People in wine work very hard. People in tech work very hard. I think the thing that's different about people in the tech world or companies in the tech world is we come together because we have to in order to serve the market. So the Bluetooth headset I'm talking on right now, Apple doesn't own the Bluetooth standard. The Wi-Fi standard that many of your viewers now are probably connected with on their computers, no single company owns this standard. The tech industry is smart enough to come together when there's something that companies like Apple and Samsung need to do together in order to create a market. And I think this is where the wine industry is, despite the fact that it's been around for thousands of years longer than the tech industry, is still quite immature in terms of its knowledge of market forces and consumer preferences. I mean, take the journey I've been on for the last 5 years here in Burgundy, converting Chateau de Pommard from a conventional agriculture to an organic and now a biodynamic agriculture. Something that I know Nicole is very familiar with too. When I first came here, she was gracious enough to come visit me and give me some lessons on this, and how hard it is. But as now I'm a consumer who, as I see the chemicals that are sprayed out in many vineyards, I don't want to drink this wine anymore. But as a consumer, how do I find these wines that are good, that are also not containing pesticides and herbicides? It's really, really, really difficult. And the wine industry makes it even harder. There's no standard. You go to every country has a different standard for organic wine, right? There are these small organizations like Demeter that, certify winemakers, but consumers really know nothing about them. So I think this is a good example of where the wine industry is so way behind the tech industry in understanding we have this next generation of millennial and Gen X consumers. They care very much about the environment. They care very much about what they're consuming and putting in their bodies. And they're conscious consumers. They know the products they buy are shaping the world around us, and they really care about the values of companies. But when they look at the wine world, they say, not only is it complicated, as I'm sure our master of wine here would tell us, but if you care about these kinds of things, how do you navigate this crazy system? It's really tough. So I would love to see the wine world be smarter about these kind of market forces and how we might collaborate together to take advantage of that and compete better globally as a collection of winemakers, distributors, you know, who care about building the business in a responsible way.
So one of the main obstacles for you in working together is a lack of understanding of, you know, what's at stake and the distribution world. And Heike, when we were prepping that conversation, you've also said something that stayed with me on, you know, the tech world is really good at failing. And and you've quoted something. You've said, in the tech world, we understand that information is not the key, that the best players are the one that know how to implement. Would you mind talking a bit more about this?
So my experience is with startups, not necessarily
yes,
tech-based.
startups,
so yes,
sorry. Yeah.
So, but the environment of startups, yes, you know, they fail and learn and test and try again. It's this, you know, cycle. So they're less afraid to, you know, implement something, try, and then see the result and move on. And to your question, you know, they found out that, and they're willing. I think you know, from my experience with startups, they work next to each other. You know, they share ideas because, you know, they understand that the power is in, you know, doing it first or doing it better, implementing. You're right, because, you know, good ideas are worth nothing if they're not implemented.
And I think to your point earlier about how long the cycles are in the wine industry versus the tech industry, you know, I can write software in an afternoon. It takes a whole year or more, 2 years really, to make a wine. So people are more reluctant to experiment for fear of making mistakes, because they're much more consequential to their business and their livelihood. But if we, you know, if we do go to some smaller winemakers, younger winemakers, whether it's here in Burgundy or, you know, I've spent quite a lot of time the last couple of years in Oregon, you know, in a town like Carlton in the west part of Willamette Valley, you have a lot of young winemakers that are really doing some very interesting experimentation. I mean, we all might think there's nothing new in Pinot Noir, but I would say, go to Carlton, come here to Burgundy, meet some of the younger winemakers and see what they are doing. That's quite different.
And thank you so much. I do also believe that there's maybe a generational aspect to collaboration, and we might enter a new era for this. Talking about new eras and new collective systems, both of you, Michael, you are leading new collective initiative. Michael M in Austria, yours is more based on locality, and Michael B, yours is more based on ethos and shared values. So if you agree, I'd like to take some time to actually assess what are those collective systems that you are building. So Michael M, you are building a new collective with the traditional wineries of Austria. Could you tell us briefly why? I mean, the first question that I had with you is why in this day and age where the consumer is already so confused about everything that exists, why would someone spend so much time and energy about building a new classification system, appellation system? I don't know how you refer to it. And you being one of the most recognized estate and a winemaker in Austria, why do you spend so much time to build that collective identity when maybe one could assume that your individual fame would be enough?
Yes, hello, everybody here from Austria. This is a very good question. The thing is that we started in Austria to build up a classification system starting in 1992. But building classification always has to be seen in the context of building an appellation system. I think that most of you know that in Austria, we started with building up an appellation system beginning in 2002. And this appellation system in Austria is still under construction. And I think that we all know that appellation systems have a lot of advantages, but they also have disadvantages. One of the big disadvantages of appellation systems is that the smaller the origin gets. So when we are going to the size of a vineyard, and so the crus, in Austria we call it Ried. So when you're going to the level of the crus, you're suddenly dealing with a high number of names that you are confronting the consumers with. So this is one of the big disadvantages of appellation systems. And in order to get an orientation system for consumers, classification can be very helpful in the orientation of consumers, wine lovers, and also for the trade. The reason that we are going for a vineyard classification system in Austria is connected to our structures that we have in Austria. You have to imagine that in Austria, our industry is very small size. So the regular size of an Austrian winery is something between 15 and 20 hectares. The bigger wineries looking to maybe a maximum of 100 hectares. So this is really small structured. Also, when you look into the structures in our vineyards, all of our vineyards, on all the crus, they're divided by 30, 40, 50 different producers and owners. So this is very much like Burgundy. And this is basically the reason that we decided to go into a vineyard classification that is rather comparable to the Burgundy system. In the appellation structure, we're also differentiating between the three-tier system, between regional wines, village wines, and single vineyard wines. And the single vineyards are then divided into Erste Lage and Große Lage, which is equivalent to Premier Cru and Grand Cru. Now, why am I doing all this work? I think that at Schloss Gulbersburg and all other wineries, we are facing the reality that in the context of wines of origins, we have two interests. We have on one side, we have an interest in our estates and to building up, our reputations. But on the other side, we also have an interest in building up the reputation of the names of origin. So this is why it's so important actually to work together, because in the moment when we start to sell a wine that is carrying the name of a vineyard, for example, Ried Heiligenstein, then it's not only me that has an interest in building up the reputation of this vineyard, it's also the interest of many other wineries that also are sharing and producing wine from this particular vineyard.
And
yes.
oh, sorry, continue.
Yeah. So that means that we are directly linked to our area, because we as a states, we are always seen in the context of our area. So the consequence is that we as wineries, we can only grow in our reputation by rising the reputation of our area. And this is something that we can only do in working together. So this is why we as wineries have a direct interest in working together in collaboration and to develop a collective idea of the wines of origin in our area.
Thanks so much, Michael. When we've discussed that topic before together, and one of the questions that I had for you is, historical appellation regional systems as they, built the European wine world, that made a lot of sense, 70 years ago, when everybody was harvesting at the same date, doing pretty much the same winemaking techniques and viticultural techniques, and there wasn't that much part for individuality. But today it's really different. Like fine winemakers, what they want to do is express their own version of the truth. They adapt the viticultural practice, they listen to their soil, they listen to, you know, the wines and have different interpretation in the winemaking cellar. How can you build a collective with expressed individualities?
This definitely is a very good question, and this is one of the big challenges today for all appellation systems around the world. I think it's a challenge on one side, but it's not impossible. The thing is that 200 years ago, the same expression of wine in area was kind of God-given by what you said, because everyone was working with the same tools, with the same techniques. People had to harvest at the same date. And on the other side, today we have to develop a collective sense for our vineyards and for the expression of our wines in different ways. I think this is why it's very important for us nowadays to have good communication with each other, to have to work intensely together and to develop and form a collective idea of our area and of our wines. We have to, I think there's one aspect that is quite important, that especially today, that in former times, appellation systems were quite stable. So they were kind of God-given. But I think today we have to develop an idea that we become a little bit more flexible in appellation systems. We need to adopt, I think, the appellations, you know, a little bit more according to our ideas in our societies, in our society of producers. And we need to find regulations, you know, that are formed by the will and the idea of a majority of producers in an area. These ideas need to be reflected in the regulations of the appellations. And I think this, at the end, it's a very democratic model.
And thanks so much, Michael. And that ties in really well with the other Michael's project, because in Vivant that you are launching in a couple of days, you kind of went over, you know, the notion of locality and origin in terms of place of wines. You will work with winemakers all around the world, not based on where they are from, but based on their ethos and like-mindedness. Could you tell us a bit more what Vivant is and how you came with that collective approach to the market?
Yeah, well, first, thank you, Michael, for your explanation of what you're doing there. I think undoubtedly my belief is that the human connection to the land will always be our strongest reference point to learn about and enjoy wine. So even though winemakers might express the terroir differently, I do believe that the cépage, the grape varietal, and the terroir will always be the things that can and should dominate. So I think it's also very natural for us as people to learn about this complex world of wine through geography. It is something that is very strongly connected to the planet. Our ethos really revolves around maybe a little bit different definition about quality and what makes for a quality wine. If you ask 10 people in the wine world, you get 10 different answers about what makes for the measurement of quality in a wine. I mean, certainly there are the common, you know, sort of predictions like Blick, balance, length, intensity, complexity. We have come to, and I guess this is really a personal journey for me, I've come to a conclusion that quality in wine can be measured in a different way, and that is how much care does the winemaker take in letting the grape express itself naturally, and really understanding that their role is to cultivate the grape in its most natural form. You know, the grape is a miracle of nature. It contains everything that it needs to turn into beautiful wine on its own. And a lot of times what we do in viticulture and winemaking is we block that potential. So if we really want to taste the grape in its truest, purest, form, and what is possible, we need to more or less get out of the way. And unfortunately, that's not where most of the wine industry is today. Less than 3% of wines globally today are made naturally, meaning people are not using herbicides and pesticides, meaning they're not over manipulating the wine in the winery. And so our definition, our kind of ethos, if you will, is we are trying to unify ourselves with other people who feel the same way, believe the same way. When they taste a naturally made wine, they know it's alive. It has more energy, it's more intense. And I think this is what the wine industry is looking for in the future, especially with the generational change that we're seeing. So to answer your question, Vivant is it's a live streaming wine experience platform. I think the first one ever dedicated to wine experiences. But all of the participants in the platform are responsible producers who are practicing sustainable practices in their vineyard, organic and biodynamic practices, not just in the vineyard, but also in the winery. But they're also practicing ethical practices in the business as well. So equal pay for equal work, non-discrimination of employment. The kind of things that we would sort of take for granted today, but a lot of people still in business are not doing. So that's what Vivant is. It has a particular bent on education. So helping people, whether they're novices or gurus, learn about this crazy complex world of wine from our point of view, I guess.
For a different entry point, and not just the locality and the origin point, but what you define as quality. If I go to the people that sell wine in this room, so Mark and Vanessa, what does all those collective narratives and that change, those different options of collective, do they make a difference for you as sommelier, as wine buyer? How important is that collective story and that togetherness when it comes to you having to pick a wine, but also you having to tell the story of a wine afterwards? I don't know who wants to come first. Vanessa, do you want to go in? Ladies first.
Sure. No, I'd be delighted, and thank you for the question. It's a good one, certainly. I would say, ultimately, it makes no difference to me how the wines come to my attention. I think for a producer, it can be quite useful in terms of if banding together in terms of an ethos or a style. Let's say, the In Pursuit of Balance that used to exist here in California. It was a very easy way to help a buyer know, okay, well, we're making wines in sort of a restrained fashion with lower alcohol. We collectively believe that this is the style that we want to make and present to the consumer. And this isn't new, at least in the United States. There are many organizations like this, Family Winemakers of California, who have that in common, or other stylistic people who make a certain variety will often present together. So it's certainly sounds more of a norm here to see producers collectively using their reputations and their influence to band together and help one another. So I would say, in terms of decision making, what I'm going to buy, however the wine is presented to me, whether that's through an individual, whether that's through a collective, ultimately the wine has to speak for itself in terms of the quality in the bottle. And ultimately, the story that it has to sell. There can be a collective story, but at least speaking for Wine Access and the business that we conduct, we tell individual stories. We also educate, let's say, about certain appellations, certainly as part of that. But ultimately, every wine has to stand on its own. And in the end, whether it's part of an appellation, whether it's part of a collective ethos, it has to be delicious and delight the consumer. And I'd say on the topic of banding together again, I think that I've seen quite innovative things here in the United States of wineries co-opting even employees. For instance, here I'm sitting in Napa Valley. There's a company where you can co-opt basically a national sales director. So let's say you're a small winery, you need to have a national reach, but you don't have maybe the means or the need to have a full-time, but you want a very high quality, experienced national sales director with the Rolodex. You can co-opt this person who represents multiple brands, and you know that in the market, this person is going to be presenting not just your brand, but other brands beside it. And then as a producer, you have to be comfortable saying, I stand behind my wine and my story, and I don't feel that presenting this in a lineup of other wines is a detraction at all. And in fact, we can all benefit from this collective investment. Likewise, even of course, hospitality is not what it used to be right now because of worldwide events, but there's also an organization here where you can co-op a hospitality person, and with the same intent that someone comes to Napa Valley, you want to taste many of these small wineries which maybe don't have a tasting room or don't have a full-time staffer. You can still go to one place, taste many properties, hear all these stories. And again, it comes down to sort of, is the wine delicious? Does it have a story? And then as a producer, are you comfortable knowing that you're not going to be the only producer in the room?
Thanks, Vanessa. Mark, in Switzerland, so old world versus new world kind of debate. How do your consumers navigate the wine list? Is the appellation, or let's say region, because it's a bigger concept, is the locality still the first thing that they look at when they choose a wine? Or could we imagine a system where they would, or do you rank, for example, the scores on the wine list, or can we imagine a system where they would be classified by like ethos, sustainable wines, or things like that? How would that play with your consumers?
Yes, thank you for the question. We have two different wine lists at the hotel. One is the big wine list, and that's very classic, sorted by region. The other is of our brasserie, the Bowers, which is a bit more modern and sorted by style or taste. So I think that's an interesting approach. But if we take this outside of my own workplace and look at it a bit more globally, it's very interesting to me when you look at very, very short wine lists, which are in gastronomy concepts that are made for mass markets, like a burger chain, for example. And then when you look at the wine list, you will see that they use different attributes to promote different wines. For example, a Shiraz will probably often be declared as a Shiraz, whereas a Rioja will often be declared as a Rioja. And in certain markets, there will be the brand, so the producer, and that will be the only thing they have on their wine list. They will usually not list the whole thing. And to me, that shows what has attraction through the last couple of decades in certain markets and in certain target groups. And if I go back to your original question on what does the sense of community, like the Austrian wine growers, for example, mean to me as a sommelier, looking at it from a bias perspective first, it's as a sommelier, you try to take a view of the whole wine world and try to stay on top of all the trends, all the new producers. But to be very honest, the wine world is moving so fast, and that's positive, that's very difficult. So it's great that when you look at a new region, there's basically that groundwork already done, that okay, if I go to that region and I go to a group tasting or a wine fair of this producers association, then I know that they will all at least have a certain same quality standard or the same ethos standard. And then I can decide for myself whether that's something I align with. And then of course, go back to Vanessa's point, the wines still need to convince, but it's an entry point. And I totally second her argument also that from a winery side, it helps you reach people, because, for example, the hotel I work for is family owned, and we could not, we are a standalone hotel, we could not have a sales force all over the world ourselves. So we work both with the brand Swiss Deluxe Hotels and the leading hotels of the world to have that easier access to potential guests. And it's the same with wineries. And if we now look at it from a selling perspective, in a restaurant, when you introduce a new wine to a consumer, there's always the chance to just tell the beautiful story and hope that he will buy it. But it often helps if you can say they're part of the same quality group like producer XYZ, which might already have a reputation for a longer period. Or even if it's something on the bottle, like the Erste Lagen sign from the ÖTW or Demeter label, then that's a very easy way to sell it by saying, yeah, you might know that, for example, Domaine Romani Conti is biodynamic. This one works biodynamic too, and here's the proof on the label. So it facilitates the selling process.
Yes, and he is in the audience, so I'm sure he will correct me, but it's Robert Joseph that once had a very good quote saying, you know, the appellation system, they're like a monopoly board, right? If you are in the Rue de la Paix, or in the very blue section, like if you are in Burgundy or in Bordeaux, you know, it's okay, your wine might sell by itself just by its locality. If you are located in any other part of the board, then you're screwed, and you have to come up with a system of, you know, make it yourself known. Go ahead, Robert, please feel free to correct me on this, but that's what you said, Mark. Like, of course, we identify wine as individual wine, but sometimes having those collective system in place that really help in being quicker at selling the wines. When we talk about being in this together, there's a dimension that we often, you know, not include in the wine world. It's the consumer. We often think about, you know, getting together amongst producers or amongst distributors or even amongst the trade, but we're not really thinking of how we can get consumers. Well, we are more and more thinking about this, but Michael B, that has always been, you know, one of the things that you wanted to do since the beginning of the adventure of Chateau de Pommard is bringing the consumer in this together with you. Could you tell us a bit how you've managed to do that, and how you changed the traditional model into bringing the consumer at the heart of your different projects?
Certainly, the idea originally emanated from when my wife Julie and I acquired the estate here in Burgundy. It was really an outlier in the area in terms of having although we're not a very big producer, I'd say we're actually a small producer. We have a very big single monopole here in Burgundy. It's 20 hectares. It's the largest monopole in Burgundy. And it's a very unique geological structure with 7 different plots within the Clos Marimonge, which is the monopole. And when we first got here, you know, I was coming from the New World, from California, where we live in the United States. And of course, everybody there has been talking for a long time about single vineyard wines, terroir-driven wines. And I was thinking, well, wow, we have the classroom right here in our backyard to teach people about this, because the estate has always bottled all of the wine from the single clos together. And the idea was to think about maybe bottling single vineyard cuvées within this monopole, in addition to doing a blend, is really the ultimate example of terroir-driven wine education. You know, come here, taste this plot right next to this plot, made exactly the same way, exactly the same winemaker, and see how Pinot Noir expresses itself differently based on the clay content, the limestone content, the alluvium content, the internal surface density of the clay, which is very important for Pinot Noir. So this was really our first step into putting education at the center of the consumer experience. You know, not necessarily in a Master of Wine kind of way or a WSET diploma kind of a way, but in a way that would give them a little something they could take home and remember and use the next time they were thinking about selecting a wine. So I think fast forward to today, you know, 6 years later now, one of your people on the chat here has mentioned this about transparency in wine. And I suppose what we're doing with education with Vivant now is about complete transparency in wine. You know, finally, the EU is pretty close to dropping, you know, the exception for wine and requiring the ingredients to be displayed. I think those of us who are making wine in a responsible way would like nothing more than to see the ingredients that's displayed on a wine bottle, right? Because to the extent that the winemaker is adding in oak chips or performing reverse osmosis or whatever it is, or spraying Roundup in the vineyard, like, consumers ought to know about that. We know about that in our food. Why don't we know about this in wine? This I think is where we've come now, with putting the consumer not just in the education spot, but also in the transparency spot of really being able to understand where these wines come from a terroir and AOC perspective, like we were talking with Michael about earlier, but also how are they made? What's in that wine that you're drinking?
And we've got a question in the chat in relation to this. How does your vision of naturally made vivant wines fit with the often absolutist concept of natural wine? zero to low SO2, wild yeast, they're refining, filtering. Like where do you put the limit or the fence?
I think the word natural wine is a difficult one, right? I mean, here I am in Burgundy. I love to drink wine with as little as or no SO2 as anybody else does, right? Fewer headaches in the morning, because I do drink wine a lot and I love wine, but also just better tasting. I mean, we have now got to the point at Chateau de Pomar where we are vinifying the wine completely without SO2. But if you said to me, would you bottle your wine in a bottle without any SO2 at all? I would say, no, no way. Because Burgundy wines are fantastic when they age. And if I don't put a little bit of SO2 in that bottle, I mean, we use a naturally occurring volcanic sulfur, you won't be able to have that bottle of wine for more than maybe 2 or 3 years. So I do believe SO2 has a small role, but it's not in mass in the vineyard. It's certainly not in mass in the vinification process, right? It's just to preserve the wine a little bit in the bottle so we can age it.
And I know that you've defined a Vivant pledge, right? That to come on board your program, wineries have to sign and to, you know, adhere. Well, I don't know if that would translate, but they have to be on board with the pledge and the charter that you put together. You've mentioned the things like equal pay for equal work, but do you have a very close definition of what makes a sustainable wine in it? Just asking, and then if you will be able to share, because it's such an interesting question, what makes a sustainable wine?
We do, and the words are difficult, right? We talk about natural, sustainable. We've gravitated towards this word responsible, maybe because it's not used so much yet and it's not contaminated, but for us, yes, all of the things you would do normally as a business that we discuss, but we look at in the vineyard, no pesticides, no herbicides, no synthetic chemicals. If you are organic today, if you are biodynamic certified today, you're already doing this, right? But there are a lot of producers that are not certified who are already doing this. Then it goes to the winery. So in the winery, no manipulation of the wine that's not natural. So as I discussed before, no additives, no artificial inputs, colors, flavors, anything that would alter the aromas, flavors, appearance of the wine, right? Any process or any input. And this leads people to really thinking about a very hands-off winemaking process. So yes, we have a very descriptive list of things that involves, and everyone in our program signs up for that pledge. We have about 60 producers now in the program, and it's expanding very quickly. So in some wine regions, you know, you go to Alsace, where I just came back from, practically everyone's making wine this way. You go to other wine regions and it's not so easy to find people making wine this way and making great wine. Just because somebody is making a sustainable, responsible wine doesn't mean it's going to be a great wine. So we should be clear about that too.
Thanks so much, Michael. And coming back to other producers, Raquel and Michael, coming from, you know, traditional regions, traditional country, could we imagine, and Raquel, this is for you first, could we imagine a world where, you know, Saugrap will promote his best wine, its finest wine, not just with along the image of Portugal, but, you know, along an international brand that would recognize fine wine around the world? I don't know if my question is clear, but, you know, so far everyone's promoted fine wine within the context of their locality. Can we imagine something different? And, you know, how? Yeah, I'll just follow up questions, but I'll let you answer this one first. Sorry.
I got it, Pauline. So first of all, I think the appellation system, you know, the first level has an important role, and you know, in keeping in being guardians of the local identity, you know, the individuality of the place, as Michael was saying, right, the terroir, and I think, you know, that has to coexist and can coexist with a different layer of, or a different collective model, you know, based on ethos, based on shared values, what you call the community. And of course, you know, I see the community system as, you know, a platform to take your wines to the market, to promote them, and also to share and advocate for, as Michael was saying, you know, important causes for you, being sustainability, being, you know, moderate and responsible consumption. Because I think it's, you know, another area and where we as a wine industry need to, you know, open our eyes and see that one of the biggest threats we are facing is actually, you know, alcohol and health, and potentially the abuse of alcohol or harmful use of alcohol. So, you know, if we can come together to, you know, spread that message, to get to the market with like-minded individuals, I think that could be very valuable.
Could you?
This is, you know, this is what I just want to interrupt and say, this is what's so fascinating about the world of wine, right? It's so complex that there are so many ways that you could slice it and say, we want to band together based on this concept or that concept, like, I don't know, Chardonnay producers of the world or something. I was just finished reading Alice Fearing's latest book, where, if you don't know her, she's a wine author out of New York, and she writes a lot about old world wines and, you know, responsibly made wines. But her book was on, what if we had a grouping or a classification system of wines based on the type of bedrock that the vines are growing in? I thought, this is like really fascinating, to compare a Sauvignon Blanc grown in granite versus a Chardonnay grown in granite from two different places in the world. Like, maybe there's really something here about this. And I think that's what keeps us all interested in wine, right? It's so complicated, it's so fascinating, and there's so many different ways you could slice it.
And if there are, if there are in the audience, they should be normally, but Loïc Pasquet from Libertaire in Bordeaux, he's got this group of winemakers that are francs de pied, and that's also how we promote quality. So Loïc, if you want to share anything in the chat. And Sarah Habert as well is just starting a program on old vines of the world, you know, gathering all the initiatives about old vines that are found all over in the world. So Sarah, if you want to tell us more about on the chat as well, you're welcome to. But there's loads of initiatives in bringing fine wine to different aspects. Raquel, as I was saying in the introduction, Sograp, you work with such a wide range of wine, from Mateus to what you call original legacy brands. How do you see the notion of collective and individuality? Because when we talk about a brand, we kind of talk about an individual and nothing collective. How do you see that notion play differently between the Mateus of your portfolio and the original legacy brands of your portfolio?
So, you know, I think that the, you know, collectivity and individuality can coexist. They're not polar opposites, you know, as long as you know, find your common ground, but hold true to your project, to your nature, to your base. I think if you can manage those two realities, you can have, you know, keep your individuality while joining forces with someone else for a greater topic. So I think when we look at our portfolio, and that is so vast, there are common themes like the ones that I just mentioned, you know, the sustainability, alcohol and health, etc., that we work across our portfolio. And then there are specific topics that we work among, you know, different estates, a subgroup of estates, a subgroup of wineries. And for those fine wines, I actually think that there's where the power of collective platforms is even more important, because they tend to be smaller, as you know, everyone mentioned here. So our big, you know, more concept brands, they're larger, and in that sense they're less dependent on, they stand alone for themselves. I think that when you move towards the fine wine end, it's more fragmented, it's smaller, and thus you need to join forces with someone else.
You know, a fantastic example of an organization, you mentioned Loic Pesquet earlier, and I was thinking about this, that has done an interesting job with this is Biodivine in France, which is an alternative certification mechanism for biodynamic wine to, say, Demeter, more run by winemakers than an independent association. And what's fascinating to me about Biodivine is you go to different wine regions in France and every chapter is completely different. You know, they all have the same kind of charter and things that they're trying to accomplish and mission, but the reason they're all so different is they're made up of the most colorful people from that wine region, and every wine region is so different. So I think this is a cool example of how people can work together yet still retain what's unique about the locality.
What is that a job that you had to do, the other Michael, like defining what gets you all together and getting that common ground that Raquel was mentioning about? We can understand the common, the common ground amongst one common portfolio, but it comes to you with the traditional wineries in Austria. What was your common ground? I remember a conversation we had. One of the that triggered the idea behind that panel was with a winemaker in the Languedoc, and it said, well, in our latest meeting together with all the appellation guys, the only common ground that we had was the price per hectare, and that's the only thing we could agree on. That's the only thing we had in common. What do you think the traditional wineries in Austria have in common that helps them see the greater good in coming together?
Well, I think it's true. When appellation systems are reducing themselves, to the question on what prices they can get for their grapes, I think it's a wrong idea, and it's a wrong basement actually, to build up an appellation system in an area. I think that the most important thing that you need in building up an appellation system is have a collective vision. And this is something that is, I think, the most important thing, when it comes to appellations, is that you develop an idea of, what the expression, the typical style of an area is all about. And this is something that you have to work on. I think I read in one of the questions or in one of the comments that appellation systems are only, where is it again? Appellation system in the past 50 years is, where is it? Has only been about, I can't find it. For most of the second half of the 20th century, European appellations were as much about limiting supply. I think this is not the point. I think this is, it's a side effect of an appellation system that you have a limited good. But I think that this is always, when we're talking about fine wine, there's always a limitation included in that. And this is something that I believe is very natural. And this is not something that is a kind of an artificial thing. I think this is something that develops out of the general situation of appellations. Appellations, the thing is that, the reason why we started to build up an appellation in Austria, in the past 50 years since World War II, Austria was very much concentrating on selling wines of grape varieties. The change from the field plant into single varietal planting was basically after World War II. The result was that for the next 50, 60 years, Austrians were mainly occupied, in the different grape varieties, with the result that suddenly, over a period of 30, 40 years, Grüne became an identity for Austria. And after the crisis of '85, you know, Austrian producers were going out of Austria, and the first thing they were communicating is, what is Grüne Veltliner? So basically they were connecting, you know, the grape variety of Grüne Veltliner to Austria. And it was something that was working out very well in the beginning. But suddenly, you know, the more popular Grüne Veltliner became, the more producers outside of Austria, you know, were starting to sell also Grüne Veltliner. And with the consequence that we realized that as long as we put all our efforts on a grape variety, we will always be second. The only thing that we can protect as Austrian producers is, you know, if we put a concentration on the names of our origins. And if we put, you know, the name of our origin on our labels, we need regulations. We need to develop an idea what is represented by the name of Kamptal, you know, when it is written in big letters on a label. In the same way as it is, you know, it's done in Burgundy. You know, there's also a collective idea in Burgundy about, you know, what kind of wine stands behind if a producer puts Clos de Vougeot on his label. And this is basically, you know, this is the philosophical background, actually, you know, behind the whole of appellation systems, is to develop an idea about what stands behind, what is the typical expression of a specific vineyard, of a specific area, of a specific village. And this is, I think this is very important when it comes to appellations. I think when it comes to appellations, it's a very democratic way, you know, in a society, because it's the only system of selling wine that is helping the weaker parts of the society. You know, a producer that is completely unknown, he's also benefiting from, you know, when he has a share of Heiligenstein, he has a possibility, you know, to get into the market. It's a very democratic and a very social system, I think.
I would say that it can be. Right? I have certainly seen that work very well in Burgundy. I have also seen it go to its political excess. You know, I mean, you take a look at the Grand Cru Association in Burgundy, right? It's managed by the producers who have the most Grand Crus, and they will never allow another Grand Cru in my lifetime, you know, in Côte d'Or, because they don't want any more competition. And so this is when you start to see things breaking down. But I would agree with you in general, it can be a very good, very democratic system to help the young and, you know, maybe not as fortunate or just starting out winemakers.
This is why I said before that for the future appellation systems need to be a little bit more flexible than in the past, you know, exactly out of the reasons that you just mentioned, Michael.
And then you can have the reverse effect. Again, one of the things, I went back to Burgundy this summer, and I went to visit some like new wave producers, new generation of producers, making, you know, identifying to the natural wine movement. And one of the things, I guess, that open to debate, but to me, natural winemaking is not really original winemaking. You can recognize the style of natural winemaking more than you can recognize the region. So I was having that debate with him and say, well, you know, does that really matter that you taste more of a natural wine than a Burgundy wine? And he said to me that, you know, he didn't really care about Burgundy, that the Burgundy name wasn't really important to him, that it was making his wine first. But then he came to me like, well, sure, it's easy for you to say that. You're in Burgundy, you put Burgundy in the label, you sell your wine for 30 euros. Nowhere in France could that bottle attract 30 euros if you were not from Burgundy. So suddenly, you know, I was really mad for all of the Burgundy people that spend hours and ages building that collective brand, which is Burgundy now, so that can people just say, I don't care about it, I do whatever I want, but still I benefit from the fact that I can sell my bottle 30 euros. So it was just, you know, one of those debates. I actually have a little poll for you guys, for everyone, because we've been talking about, you know, regional system and regional way of getting together, classification system as, you know, identified and recognized level of quality, and what Michael has been introducing, you know, community system. So let me try to see if that works. but I could launch that poll. Normally, you should all be able to see the poll on your screen, and you should all be able to vote. If you want to give us your views, what do you think is the most promising system of coming together for fine wines in the year to come? Would that be regional slash, appellation system? We work together because we are from the same place. Classification system, we work together because of similar level of quality, or community system, working together because of shared ethos, but also none. Like, you can also are really free and allowed to believe that individual brands is what prevails and what we should invest on developing.
Pauline, I'm going to have to go.
Thank you so much, Michael, for being with us. Do you have any questions that you would like me to address to the panel once you're gone, and I can send you the answers?
I would be very interested to know what the panelists think the future of wine distribution looks like. This is a really interesting topic, and I think relates back to the appellation system and the question you just posed, right? Is the power with the producer, the appellation system, the distributors, or the consumer? I think this is a fascinating question looking out into the future. But I just wanted to thank you for having me, and it was so nice to meet you all. It's great to meet like-minded, fun people in the wine industry to have these conversations with.
And it's vivant.eco, right, for people to go and see?
Vivant.eco, it launches on Monday the 14th. We use ECO, which is a new domain extension for brands and businesses that are ecologically minded.
And Michael, before you go, I'm quite sure that we actually met at a cafe in Bonn several years ago. Now that we're sitting here together.
Quite possible.
Yes. Yeah. So wonderful to see you again.
There's only 500 people in Pomar, so occasionally I go over to Bonn for a coffee or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So community systems seems to be quite popular in our pool. Thanks, Michael. Take care, and good luck for the launch. We keep our finger crossed for you. So yeah, community system seems to be very interesting. And that's, leads me to a question for you, Mark and Vanessa, that also Robert has addressed in the chat. If the grower doesn't care about typicity, if we move away from this appellation system, what guidance is there for the buyer? And that led to one of the questions that I had for you. If we are moving into a world where there are more and more individuality, does it make the thing, easier for you, more interesting, more difficult? And what about the consumers in all of this? What is there to find in different getting together system? Mark, do you want to take this one first this time?
Okay, thank you. Yes, I think the consumer is very often overlooked, and the more there is on a wine label, the more difficult it becomes for a consumer to understand. And I can say that without shame, because I come from Germany, which I believe are some of the most confusing labels for everybody who doesn't speak German. And I think we need to make sure that the wine labels promote a clear message, because otherwise I agree totally with what Robert will be saying. Somebody will buy the Burgundy producer you visited and thinks he's going to get a classic Pinot, and will have something quite different in his glass and won't really understand what has gone wrong. And of course, in a fine dining environment, that will always be solved by the sommelier curating his wine list and explaining the wines to the guests. But we also have some wine shops, and now we see a lot of wine being sold online. So the message of what this bottle is conveying needs to be quite simple and short. And I think that's very important. And there are certain classifications which work very well in that aspect, like certain vineyards. It's clear it's a small single vineyard, so it's a high quality, especially if it comes with an addition like a Premier Cru or an Erste Lage. But for example, in Germany, we have vineyards which look like a vineyard name, but are actually a grouping of vineyards, and that's very confusing, something the new German wine law is trying to solve if it goes through the parliament. So yes, we need to work on the message of conveying that. And I think the less we have on a label and the more traction certain stickers or certain words have, the easier it will be for the consumer in the end. But of course, that it will be difficult to reach.
Is that the same thing for you, Vanessa? And does, you know, selling wine online, and of course in the time of today, we have to think about online a lot. Is it the same thing? Do we convey the same message through online, or does it require like, do people have to put the information differently when it's an online setup?
Well, I'll speak just on behalf of Wine Access, but I mean, I believe that our responsibility, the consumer, is the same as would be if we were standing tableside in a restaurant, which is to describe very accurately what's in the bottle. And because we don't have the back and forth interaction in the online space, there's even more onus on us to be very clear about what is in the bottle. And to go back to, I think, sort of the impetus of the original question is typicity. And yes, I do think with a certain buyer, we've been talking a lot about Burgundy, of course, you know, there is an expectation of stylistically what you're going to get in a bottle of Pommard versus Volnay. However, to go back to something Raquel said earlier, I also don't think that sort of typicity or sort of collective and individuality can't coexist. I think to stay stuck in a mindset that every single producer is going to be making something the same way. I think this is what Michael was saying earlier, is that, you know, time marches on, and there are individual expressions that are possible within the same appellation. You know, I have a music background, so I always use a lot of musical analogies, but, you know, for one person to take the same Mozart sonata, they're going to play it very differently. It's still Mozart in the end. But so there's a common thread there. And in terms of sort of transparency, Mark, what you're talking about, you know, in the absence of sort of upending the entire labeling system, I think our responsibilities to the consumer is to very accurately convey, again, what is to expect there. So yes, this is maybe from a classic region. However, this producer does X, Y, and Z in the cellar, which is going to translate itself into the glass in terms of this expression. Because I think the worst thing that we can do as a wine community is to disappoint the consumer, is to set up an expectation for something that they're not going to get, whether that's through natural winemaking, whether that's through, you know, other vinification or maturation methods, or, you know, anything that's sort of outside of what we think of as is the norm. But I think it's quite common here in Napa, let's say, that, you know, there is sort of a stylistic expectation, but the winemaker here is really the star. It's not, it's more than the appellation. And with these winemakers, they definitely have their expressions, yet they're all bonded by this common community of Napa Valley.
Is there I mean, that's going to sound terribly cliche, but I don't care, I'm going to put it out there. Can we say that, you know, all traditional winemakers would respond better to the concept of appellation when, you know, younger millennials, we touch on that, that's certainly, you know, Michael B point of view, that to address that new generation, we have to come together with a different offer. How does it sound to you with your consumers? Do you see them interacting with those collective notion differently? You know, we didn't really talk about Parker scores, but there's a way of classification and there's a way of getting together as well. So can we say that was a system of the past and that community is a system of the future, or is it totally wrong to think that way?
In terms of generational cohorts,
yes,
is the question. No, it's a great question. It's a complicated question. And of course, I think the danger is we often also talk about a group like millennials as if they're sort of one collective mind. And in reality, there's so many individual, you know, segments of consumer within that. But I would say, to make a mass generalization, of course, that we've seen that the millennial cohort and younger, they don't want to necessarily drink the way that their parents did or their grandparents did. There's also much more variety available. So can we say it's the chicken or the egg? Is it that they want something different, or that there's more things available now, both in terms of style, region, but availability in terms of different channels? So I think it depends. I think there are certain consumers, as we've seen, who are very classic in terms of what they expect, but there's also definitely a more exploratory ethos with these younger consumers. And I would say also something that we haven't talked about yet is beyond what region they're buying is how is it priced? and where can they find value. And I think that in some cases, some of these more classic regions are struggling with the younger consumer who's maybe just getting into wine drinking, yet alone collecting, and that there are many opportunities for lesser known or up and coming regions to capture their wallet share because of that.
Marc, would that be the same thing for you at the restaurant?
Yes, I totally agree. For example, I live in Switzerland, and close to here, there's a region called Grison or Graubünden. And to me, they make outstanding Pinot Noirs, and people just don't speak about it much also in terms of availability. But I think with Burgundy prices soaring, many great Pinot and Chardonnay producing regions in the world have a huge market chance. And I totally agree with Vanessa. I just wanted to ask a question to the rest of the panelists, because the first thing I thought of when I read the headline, "We're in this together," is, of course, as many things this year, the crisis we are all in together. And I think Vanessa also mentioned the word responsible community. And I think we as a wine community can still improve on thinking in that community sense. And especially in the buyer-seller relationship, I think we sommeliers need to improve that when regions have a real problem like the wildfires we saw in several regions, especially overseas regions like Australia and California, that we need to help those regions in difficult times by promoting them more and speaking about these problems with our guests. But I think on the other hand, where most of Europe is in lockdown and wine is still being sold through online shops, so especially big winery companies are still making a little bit of profit. I think we need to think the other way. Maybe what can the wineries do to help the gastronomy by flexible paying options, by more kickbacks next year, by thanks to the travel budgets they saved for the big companies, for example. And I think that's something where, to my opinion, we need to improve thinking about each other. We're in this together in a crisis means to help each other whenever one has the chance. But I'd love to hear the opinion of the rest of you on it.
Maybe, Raquel, I know you've done a lot of things through SOGRAP, and of course, I know that you've considered your community through that crisis. And one of the questions I had for you when we prepped is, when there's so much going wrong, when everything's on fire, where do you start? Like, who do you take care of first? And how do you extend your circle of care? Like, how did it work for you this year, this working together thing?
So first, thank you, Marc, for the challenges. It's a very important topic. So, Pauline, we started, back in March, April, the first priority was to make sure that our people were taken care of. They were safe. And then, we start with thinking of our customers and our community. And I think that if we all, do what we can for the community the communities that we operate in, I think we could have a great impact. So, in terms of all the flexibility that Marc was talking about, I think the first is to talk to your customers, to understand their position, to see, be flexible enough to see how you can help them, through this time, through this process. And I think the solution depends on, the needs and the situation of every individual customer. And for instance, Liberty in the UK, they did the same. And I think they even strengthened the relationship with their customers even more through the pandemic. And in the end, as David Leaf says, I think the best you can do for your customer is an impeccable service, right? You don't want to give them more problems. You want to solve their problems. And then the community, for instance, right in April, we started producing alcohol gel. So instead of wine, we produced in-house alcohol gel, and we were delivering it to hospitals in our area, to firemen, all the institutions that needed them. So I think sometimes it looks simple, but if you can do the best for the communities where you are, we would all be better.
And one of the things we mentioned when we were prepping this panel as well is, you said to me, there's a big difference in mindset. I mean, we've touched a bit on money and price, but there's a big difference in mindset when you manage your P&L, when you look long-term and short-term, and that also impacts how people can work together, because they are not comparing the same P&Ls and the same budget, Could you develop this a bit more?
So I think the way it's again time, I think, right? And the time frame, because you think of this in the long run, you will be here for the next generation to come. So, you know, maybe you have to sacrifice the short term in order to guarantee the sustainability of your business and that you're here for more generations to come. So that difference in, you know, looking at return on investment, you know, looking at when are you expecting to get the payback of this investment that you're doing, or I think that makes a huge difference when you're in wine versus other sectors.
And that may be, you know, one of the points, like what's our common ground? Well, maybe the long-term vision could be our first.
Exactly.
When we talk about community, and to build on Mark's question, Vanessa, I'm sorry for putting you on the spot, but there's something that's always struck me with that notion of community, is community could be quite exclusive in some extent. Like you do take care of just a small group of people, the one that are either local or do share the same kind of interest with you. So how can we still think in terms of community for everything that it brings, but make sure that it's not exclusive and it's still inclusive? Because that's the notion that I struggle. Like, how can a community be exclusive? Is that by nature exclusive? And how does that tie in with all the discussion on inclusivity that you've been having?
By community, do you mean the wine business as a whole?
Well, we're all talking since the beginning, like we are in this together, we have to take care of our community. Then we see that word being used over and over again. Like this year, I've never heard the word community as much as before, and that's always struck. And we never had as much conversation about inclusivity as well in the wine world, like the long overdue conversation. But how can we manage that? Isn't a community by nature exclusive? And if we keep on talking about community, how can we make sure that they are inclusive? It's a very broad philosophical questions. I don't know if you.
No, I have a couple of thoughts on that, depending sort of on you know, how you want to narrow the question or define the terms. But I think, you know, speaking about the wine community, there's our internal togetherness, and then there's us presenting right to the consumer, to come back to that. And I think that, going back to, I believe, what Mark and I were commenting on earlier in terms of our responsibility to the consumer and communication, is that as an industry, I think we have a lot that we could improve upon, whether it's to go back to the earlier conversation about, you know, ingredients, however, you know, or style in the bottle, of what to expect in terms of typicity. But I think that we've been very slow to be able to speak about ourselves in a way to the consumer that is both accurate, educational, but not pedantic, or, to go back to your word, exclusive. And again, you know, I have a background in classical music before I entered the wine business, and this would be a very frequent topic of conversation around the dinner table of my parents, who are both classical musicians too, which has struggled long with this notion that it's elitist, or that you have to know something. There's a very high barrier to entry before you can even begin to know how to enjoy it. And so that's something that I personally feel very passionate about. And it sounds like many of these panelists do as well, in terms of engaging with the consumer, helping them to understand what to expect, helping them to continue to grow and engage with our community. And then I think on the supplier side as well, I saw a comment earlier in the chat about, I think, social media. I think we've also been very slow to adapt means that other industries have long incorporated in terms of getting out our messaging, whether that's social media, or frankly, you know, if I live in Napa Valley, I love this community and these wineries. If I just take a quick search of a handful of winery websites, it's very difficult to find information on many of these websites. And you know, a lot of them have sort of built a reputation on sort of please inquire. I'm not going to be forthcoming. And I think if you think of from the consumer side, now that there's so much variety, there's so many wines to choose from, there's so much accessibility online, you know, the best thing you can do is to sort of welcome these inquiries. And it goes back to your earlier question about millennials too, and this sort of sense of wanting to understand more, and how do we bring them into our world as well. So I you know, I take your question to in one regard in that sense, and I think your other question was perhaps more about what we've been seeing in terms of Black Lives Matter, or you know, the recent scandals with certain organizations. And I think it's I don't think that our industry is alone in these struggles, but I do believe that we've also been slow to recognize them, and I think that we have a lot of work to do. And the very first step is frankly just to start talking about them and to normalize that we have the same struggles that other organizations do, or other industries, and we need to not be afraid to talk about that.
I like how you refer to internal community and external community. That makes it quite clear to me to understand, like, take care of each other and take care of the larger thing. And yeah, I'm processing at the same at the same time.
Sorry, that was a long answer.
That's good. And Michael, to follow up on this, because one of the, I mean, Vanessa talked about, you know, engage and reach out to the consumer and give them, you know, bring them into our world. Well, one of the traditional way that winemakers have been doing so is by organizing fairs and you know, salons and big tastings, and of course it's a bit difficult to think about, you know, big fairs coming back in the foreseeable future, and I know that you are really well engaged into Vivinum, which is the Austria big tasting fair. With the Austrian Winery Association, you think a lot about how to get together in terms of production, but you also think a lot about how to get your message across and how to communicate your values, your ethos. And have you changed plan this year in compared to, you know, the type of tools that you would use normally? Like, what's your plan for the next months?
I mean, we have seen that ProWine now is cancelled. I'm pretty sure that Vivinum will take place, which will happen at the end of May, the last 3 days in May. I'm expecting that infection curves will go down in April, May. So I'm very positive that these things will happen. In fact, we have also been doing our most important tasting this year, which is in Grafenegg, the presentation of all Erste Lage wines. So here, the most important journalists came for the tasting, Chances Robinson, Robert Parker, all the big journals were here. So this was in the first week of September, so during a period where it was still possible to do all that. Of course, we have all been developing different formats. You know, one is just what we're currently doing. And this is something that will be a part of the game also for the future, I believe. Now, everything else, I think, is kind. We really don't know, you know, what's going to happen. I think we have to be flexible and all that. Now, there was a question from Robert that he was asking to put a little bit more on the consumer side, well, I think that, you know, when it comes to the consumer, I think the most important thing is that in the context of appellations and collective sense is that he gets a clear message of what he can expect from specific terms and from specific, also in the classifications, for example, what can you expect from a Premier Cru? What can you expect from a Grand Cru? I think this is something that is very important from the view of the consumer. And So I think when we are working together in associations like the Austrian traditional wineries, Österreichische Traditionsweingüter, so I think we need to put a really big effort actually on this, what we call the quality promise. So that means to have a clear communication on what can a consumer expect from a Premier Cru from Austria, from the Danube area, and all that. And this is, I think, from the consumer side, I think the most important thing. When it comes to different consumer, I think this is also what we have been discussing, the young generation versus the old generation that is more adopted to appellation systems, the younger generations trying to be more the rebels. I think this is something that has always been happening in the world of wine. So I think this is not something that is really new. I think this is something that always happened. I think that just the segments are different. And I think that 30, 40, 50 years ago, I think the same happened with grape variety marketing versus marketing of appellations was about the same thing as today with the natural wines against, traditional forms of wine names and all that. So I think that a young generation is very emotional driven. So that means the question is, how do I get access to the world of wine? And this is, I think, this is the first step is the most important. And this was maybe 20 or 30 years ago. It was much easier by the concept of grape varieties. Nowadays, maybe it's easier for a young generation via the concept of natural and orange wines, And I think that the more someone who gets into the world of wine, the more he wants to learn about the world of wine, the more he gets then into the appellations and the typical expressions of origin, because it needs knowledge, it needs experience. And this is something that takes time. And here, I think this is the very strong part of appellations. This is something that appellations can offer. And I think for the real fine wines of the world, I think the concept of appellations on the long term will always succeed.
Thanks so much, Michael. And Mark, I'd like to link that to you because Michael's been talking about building bridge with the consumer, being there, to guide him or her, to give them access to wine. I mean, sommeliers, they are, one of the key people in doing so. But Vanessa mentioned it a bit earlier. The world of sommelier has been shaken so much this year by both the crisis and various scandals. We're not going to talk about them today, but I know that you've got a big vision for the sommeliers of tomorrow. Like, how do you see the community of sommelier getting together, and what could that bring in for the future of fine wine?
Yes, I think the beauty we have seen in the sommelier profession this year on the positive side has been working across borders even when we're all locked down. And I think, as Michael said, these Zoom connections will continue to stay with us. But I think at the same time, it's a time for reflection on our profession. And one of the things that always makes me cringe is when guests ask me, I'm eating fish, but I would like to order red wine. Is that okay for you? Because that shows me that our profession has done a very bad job and has been very dogmatic in our approach, and thereby scaring people away from our wine community, saying, okay, I can't go to a fine dining restaurant because I might make a fool of myself if I ordered the wrong wine. And that's not the way it should be. Wine should be fun. And we need to get that message out. So I think we need to be very careful that we look at what have other parts of our industry done well. And I think fine dining is a prime example of Michelin restaurants used to be very, very stiff. And now service is becoming a bit more casual, also in luxury hotels. And I think we need to approach wine the same way. I found it interesting today, we spoke a lot about wine critics. And to me, they are a bit like restaurant guides or hotel stars. But what has revolutionized which restaurant comes to the top of the community are things like TripAdvisor. And there is already the TripAdvisor of wine out there, which to me is Vivino. And I think it's very interesting when we will see more community-based ratings on wines gaining traction, people will be more open to express their own opinion and say, okay, I like this wine, I gave it Vivino points, and I see others gave it Vivino points, even if that wine does not have a high Parker rating. And I think that's something we need to foster and engage.
Do you see yourself? I mean, sommeliers have always been, advocate to some extent, but how would you manage this advocacy? Like, you want to stand up and give a voice to some wines, but you also have to serve your consumer, which should always be, the first job of a sommelier, making sure that he or she will have the best moment at your restaurant. How can you manage this, maybe this more active role in advocating and being a voice for producer, helping them cutting through the noise, because that's something that they will need more and more, because everyone's online now, and there's loads of Instagram live, and there's maybe not as much wine trades as ever. So we will need people like you to be, a gatekeeper. How do you, well, a gate opener, maybe more than a gatekeeper. How do you balance this with your duty to the consumer?
I love the fact that you use the word advocate, because to me, a word I always like to use is ambassador. And I think both have something in common. An ambassador and an advocate is working for somebody. And I see us as somebody working for the producers, being the ambassadors to the consumers. That means an advocate and ambassador does not have his own agenda. And I think that's a danger we see in many wine programs, that they are being tailored to the sommelier community, to ourselves, that they have a lot of natural wine, they have a lot of Girard, which are great wines, but they might create in certain target markets or certain restaurant guests, the fact that the consumer is left out and he doesn't find any wines he is familiar with. And I think we as a sommelier need to make sure that we are the advocates, like you said, of the wineries, but at the same time, try to keep the focus on the consumer, who is the one who guarantees that we have a job by coming to our restaurant and buying the wine from us. And yes, maybe introduce him to some new discoveries, but I think it all needs to be in a good balance.
I am going to totally jump horses, but we've talked about transparency, we've talked about labeling laws, we've talked about being responsible to the consumer. I've seen some chat about Cameron Diaz having 7 million followers versus Cause d'Estionel having 18,000 on Instagram, and we had those conversations on clean wine and transparency a lot. And when we have those discussions, I always think of, we can talk about this all we want within us and within our community. It won't make a difference if there's no legal, legislation and legal regulation about this. So long story short, Raquel, I would like to address this with you, because you are taking over George Sanderman this year, and you are going to be the one going to Brussels to defend some of the interest of the wine industry, the wine ecosystems. What are you going to defend? Like, what's in your agenda, and what are the projects that you think deserve the time and the ears of people at the European Commission?
Oh, good, nice question, Pauline. I think that in the arena of policy, that's where you're trying to move now. Although we may, we are involved and we want to be, to engage the key policymakers and discuss with them. We're not always successful, and usually it takes a long time for something to happen. So it's a bit different from advocacy or promotion, where sometimes you can see the results quite fast. In terms of, I believe that as a leading company, Sagrap has the responsibility to help shape this context. To promote an environment, a social, an economic, and a political environment where we can all develop our business in a sustainable way. So, of course, I think the first step and the way to do this is, and at every level, to get involved in your national, in your local association, regional, in your national trade industry body, and then, if possible, be involved at an European level with the Comité 20, for instance, with CEF, where I think you can try to be part of and influenced the discussions around alcohol and society, alcohol and health that I mentioned before, consumer information that, was mentioned here in the panel, about environment and research, about the organization of the European market, the internal rules, about external foreign trade. So there are several topics where you can be involved, and there are several dossiers that you could choose to follow. I think in the end, you need to also focus, on what matters most to you. But, we want to, and I think that we want to preserve the heritage of wine, and to make sure that, for generations to come, they will be allowed to experience and to drink wine. So in the end, that's what we work for.
As you were mentioning some OGM project, like there's a big discussion about are we going to allow OGM,
exactly.
Genetically modified organism, and if I can, and that's certainly going to be one of the mission of ARENI next year, but that's something that we've learned in all geopolitical discussions that we had with ambassadors, with geopolitical think tank, is that never underestimate the power of regulation, and never underestimate the power of Europe to set the tone for the rest of the world. So again, if we want the world to be more transparent, to have clear labeling rules, to make sure that fine wine is still seen as special and not just as commodity alcohol, like we have to get together around this.
Pauline,
yes,
let me just jump in to reinforce something that you're saying. So as you know, we have wineries in Chile, Argentina, and also New Zealand, and when talking with my colleagues from there, they actually they mention what you just said, is that, for instance, their local associations, their national associations, they look up to Europe, to what Europe is saying, to what Europe is determining, and they tend to follow it, because of course, typically they're also, more open-minded, and they're export focused, so they look up to Europe. So couldn't agree more to what you're saying.
There's a direct question for you on this. Would you like to see compulsory disclosure of wine producers' carbon footprint available to the consumer? Is that something that you would fight for?
Well, I would like to see wineries engaging in voluntary disclosure of carbon footprint. The same way that we promote self-regulation in advertising, and moderate consumption in a voluntary way. I'm a believer of self-regulation in these matters. So, because I'm a believer in individuality and not having to impose things, but definitely. And I think that, it's something that the new generations are demanding, is to understand the footprint, not only the carbon footprint, but I would say, how sustainable is this wine? Am I paying enough a fair price for the grapes that I'm buying? If I'm buying, am I paying fair wages? Am I using, the most environmentally friendly techniques? I think all that needs to be taken into account.
So we've got 10 more minutes to finish our discussion, and there's a question that would like to address to all of you, so panel and audience alike. I would like to know if over the last year, and we've seen so many new initiatives of people working together on one way or another to advocate or to champion a cause in the particular part of the wine world, or in more global. It doesn't have to be in wine, it can be in totally something else. What is the collective initiative in wine or not in wine that you've seen happening this year and that you think are particularly relevant for the future and the survival of our ecosystem moving forward? So that's a question for all of you.
So what's the most important collective initiative?
Yes, that you've seen either rising this year, or it doesn't have to be new, but it's something that is particularly relevant for you regarding the future of fine wine. And it can be something else, you know, it doesn't have to be wine related, but that's something that we can get inspiration from in addressing that notion of, you know, because again, we're all here for the same thing, is make sure that fine wine is still here in 10, 15 years, and the next generation will still be able to enjoy fine wine. That's the end game. There's different way of getting there. One of them can be collective. So if you've got any examples, I don't know who in the panel would like to take that. And if you've got, yeah, Matt.
I think it leads back to something Raquel said earlier about the way they moved at Sograp during the first wave of the crisis, is to get into a mindset where you think about the community. And two examples I would like to share with you is one I think many of you will have experienced, that in big cities, I live in Zurich, usually you don't know your neighbors very well. Usually they are anonymous apartments, but at the beginning of this very special situation, suddenly people were looking at the neighbors and were looking, okay, do we have some elderly people in the neighborhood and can I go shopping for them? And that's a very small thing, but I think to have that mindset to go into your community and see what's the small step I can do and then extrapolate from that is something we can all benefit from. And we've seen that also, especially in the hospitality and restaurant industry, where your original job position has become more or less irrelevant because everybody's just working frantically to get the industry to survive by building up catering models, by takeaway models, helping other departments. For example, we have both hotel and wine shops, and now the hotel is still rather quiet. So a lot of people from the hotel are helping in the wine shops to pack Christmas boxes. And I think to have that openness to change quickly and to adapt while thinking, how can I help the next person and ensure that we will continue in a long time. I think to have this mindset will also help the fine wine world.
I think Maya Kamas, if you're still here in the audience, you can give us your initiative as well, because it was really close to Mark, the way you've reached out to each of your consumers individually to ask if they were okay, and what you could do to help them. That was one of the initiatives that really struck me at the beginning of lockdown as well, how you took some time to literally pick up the phone and call everyone. That was a good, see, she's saying we are doing something similar again as we go back into lockdown. Yeah, great minds comes alike. Vanessa, what would be the collective initiative that you think is important for us to get inspiration from?
I think it goes back to a previous question that you answered, which covers the topic of inclusivity. I think that drawing more voices, different types of voices into our industry can only actually help us be stronger externally as well. And so, you know, if you look at a lot of the initiatives, Wine Unify, you know, that Mary Margaret McCamick founded, for instance, to amplify voices of color. I mean, at Wine Access, we have a scholarship initiative for, we're funding 100 people to go through, Black and Indigenous people of color to go through WSET level 1. And that's just a couple of examples just right here in my own community. So I think responding to not just the wine community, but to the voices of the entire worldwide community in terms of what we need to do to be more inclusive and to get stronger together. I think seeing the way that many parts of the wine industry have responded to that has been incredible and very inspirational.
Michael, what kind of initiative have you witnessed this year that gave you inspiration and give you hope for the future of fine wine?
Well, I mean, it has been a very challenging year for every one of us, and you know, our movement is quite young and is also developing, and so we have a new initiative in the northern parts of Austria that would like to join the movement, and we have an initiative in the Burgenland area that is starting to work now in this direction, and I think that. The whole situation has accelerated the whole development, I think. I think that people are aware about the benefits of all these developments, and I think that currently we are seeing that there's a big interest and a change in mindset beyond producers also here in Austria.
Raquel, have you seen anything in Portugal, or and that can be with your startup, because Raquel also advised startups in tech, so I mean that can be from that world too.
But actually, I was going to mention an example from the wine industry. It was not created in 2019, but I think it gained special relevance in this last year, and that is the wine in moderation movement. It was and it has been a challenging time for many people, and wine cannot be used as a refuge or cannot be used in a harmful way. And we know that, you know, the situation was, there are many situations where people are in really poor economic conditions, you know, their livelihoods being threatened, and it's easy to go to use wine in a harmful way. So, you know, I think that the power of moderation message of the motto, choose, share, and care, it's extremely important, not only for challenging times like the ones that we're living, but also for the future.
And for those of you who don't know, there's this association, Wine in Moderation, which is again a European association, and that gather all national associations of different countries in Europe that do promote wine in moderation. And they came up with that campaign, choose, share, care.
Share, care.
Yeah, which is really good. And they've got loads of material if you want to use this. If there's loads of things. I'm also addressing the wine educators in Rome, because I know there's quite a lot. If you want to talk on, if you want to touch base on the topic,
when you reach out to me and I'll make the connection.
And there's really good material there. There are people mentioning, you know, sustainability and individual wineries leading the way and just, you know, declaring themselves sustainable and making it really clear to the customer. There's been, I mean, to me, there's been so much initiative. There's been importers like Liberty or different other importers here in the UK that have put together a fund for restaurants. So when you buy and when you order wine, there's part of that order that goes into restaurants' accounts. So when they reopen, they would have a bit of cash to buy wine and help them start again, which I thought was a really, really interesting initiative. The way distribution and production has come together in a closer way this year, as you said, Mark, really listening to whether you're on the distribution or production side, really listening to the other sides and treating the other as a partner and not just as a source of money, I think is quite inspirational. Thank you all very much for this. I am going to call Nicole Rollet back for the last words, and I'm sure, Nicole, you travel, well, you usually travel the world. You're a bit more sedentary like all of us this year, and you also are, you know, involved in so many other aspects than wine. Maybe you would like to share, first of all, your inspirational action and what kind of collective initiative gave you inspiration and hope this year.
Well, actually, I think initiatives such as the discussion groups at ARENI, but also many other organizations, the Wine to Wine just had some very good things. I think big hats off to Robert Joseph and his initiative. Anything that brought a collective discussion together this year was particularly necessary and meaningful. And I think that working with Mark's idea, which is to bring some bottom-up, hands-on, practical measures together. So you have the theory, you have the process, you have the hands-on, you have the big picture. I think that's where it's all going to converge. And for me, that was really a roadmap of how to connect the dots in a difficult year like this one, and I think a lot of you have been doing the same. So I hope that this is going to be continuing. We have our sustainability initiative, which I think falls into this example a lot, which is to bring together the top scientists from important institutions like UC Davis and University of Sussex, the INRAE, to try to find ways to use bees to make better wine that reflects terroir. Initiatives like that you can actually control. The European organizations like European Commission are very interested in our markets, and I know some of your other parts of the world. So going forward, I believe that this idea of regrouping people around themes, where a lot of winemakers have reached out to us to collaborate with us on that project, and all of you are doing similar things in your areas. More and more, we're going to be seeing that partially technology, partially the evolution of things. So the comments that Mark and Michael and Vanessa and Raquel made today, I think are really converging for me in confidence that that a consumer, once they have access to the information, is going to be in an incredibly strengthened position, that if they're interested in appellation, if they understand and they want to be guided for that, that information will continue to be accessible to them. And we all have to work to make sure that the appellations that are not fully fulfilling their missions, as well as the ones that Michael was talking about, up their game. And then the others are going to be really doing a great job. So you have been amazingly clear and helpful panelists. So thank you so much for bringing these ideas to the forefront today. I personally gained a lot from it, even though it's a subject that I think about all the time. So it's incredibly helpful of you.
Oh yeah, I did mute myself, and I was mad at myself because I couldn't manage the chat, and I was getting confusing myself with the links that I wanted to send. Thank you very much, Nicole. And sorry, I forgot to introduce you, but of course, Nicole Rollet is the co-founder of ARENI Global and the chair, and she's also leading Chêne Bleu Wine in Provence. If you want to go and see what has been called super Rhone wines, and if you want to see what quality can do in Provence, please go and have a look at Nicole's wine. Thank you so much to all of you panelists for, I mean, as usual, it's very selfish of me, but you know, I get all those great people to ask questions, and I've got all those great answers that do give so much inspiration and hope for the future of fine wine. As usual, we will have a recap. We will, you know, write a series of articles recapping this, plus all of the insight. Again, as I was saying, we had some great insights from New Zealand and Australia also to bring to the discussion, because we always try to have the most diverse possible voices, but it was really difficult to bring them in due to time zones. So we'll bring them in the analysis. Please do subscribe to the newsletter if you want to receive all of this. Please consider being a member if you want to continue being part of those discussions, joining us for the roundtables next year. I am finishing the calendar for next year, where we'll be talking about social gastronomy and how we can reinvent the restaurants model and what it means for fine wine, as so far we depend so much from restaurants. I'm sure, Mark, you will have loads of ideas about this. We will be talking about digital and how, you know, we can use digital to reach out to consumers, and for buyers also to use digital to access winemakers, because this is going to be another difficult year to travel. We will be releasing our study on the fine wine consumers at the end of this January. So again, if you want to receive the exact summary, join the newsletter. And we will be talking about joy and pleasure and moderation and what it means for fine wine. We will be talking about climate change. We'll be talking about sommeliers. There's so many things. And if you want us to cover some particular topics, that's also why we're here. So please send us your ideas, or what you would like to, you know, the themes and ideas that you would like to see discussed, because of course we're more than happy to organize something around this. I
would say also the results of the polls were quite interesting.
Oh yeah,
sharing those, because
I'll share them in the newsletter. But yeah, long story short, the community system, 55% of you, and we run that Paul through our newsletter as well, is quite a system which is believed to be relevant for the future. The classification and the regional appellation system are still considered important too. We'll mix them all with all the numbers, that the data that we collected from other sources. And some people still think that individual brands are what matter the most. And I mean, there's a really strong argument in this too. So thank you so much for participating.
And Pauline, thank you so much for putting everyone together. And I have an idea based on listening to you all, which we'll follow up on as well, because since so many of you believe that these new communities are an important part of the future of fine wine, perhaps we can help with ARENI to create forums for these communities to come together and for people to find each other within them. So that should be interesting as well. So thank you all. This is how great ideas are born.
Thanks so much for being with us today. Thank you very much, all of our audience, for staying with us till the end. We always raise some eyebrows when we say it's going to be a 2 hours conversation, but you see there's so many grounds to be covered. So thank you very much for your attention and for your participation. I am going to read all the chat tonight, so you'll be in my mind. Take care, have a wonderful December. I know that for some of you, that's the busiest weeks of the year. So good luck, and enjoy the holiday, enjoy your family and your dear ones and your community, and we will see each other very soon. Bye everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you
So much.